Reverend Peter Thomas Stanford. He wrote this book. The Tragedy of the Negro was first published in 1897. And here is a picture of the opening of the book. This is P.T. Thomas Stanford. He was born a slave in 1860, Emancipation Proclamation in 1862, and the slaves were freed in 1865. Later on, he was able to become highly educated. He made his way to Canada and from Canada to England. At some point, a group of eminent people from America and also England, they came together and they wanted to bring the attention to the American government, which of course they already knew what was going on. But nevertheless, they wanted to bring attention to the lynching, the barbarous treatments that Black people were subjected to in America. So Reverend P. Thomas Stanford came to America, and this is how the book came about. And so the stories you are going to hear, they are all in this book. It was thousands of people that attended Henry Smith's lynching, and they came from other counties, even other states. Henry Smith was a 17-year-old man. This is the account that I read when I Googled. It's no longer there. It's as if it's been scrubbed. The accounts that I just saw today were painting a picture as if he was this monster. But the account that I read was that he was a 17-year-old man, hardworking, handyman, very quiet, kept to himself. And many of the people in his neighborhood and around town considered him slow. Sheriff Henry Vance set out to harass and abuse Henry Smith. He jailed him and also he beat him. So after being jailed 2 times, Henry Smith had sense enough to know, I better get out of here because this man has it out for me. So he fled, and he was found in another state. He was brought back to Paris, Texas. So what you're going to see in this video is Henry Smith himself. The crowds, the mob, that's real. That is real photographs taken by photographers and journalists that were actually at the lynching. So here is the account of the lynching of Henry Smith. Paris, Texas, February 1st, 1893. A more horrible death than that which was meted out to Henry Smith, the colored ravisher and murderer of little Myrtle Vance. In this city today, history does not record the execution of a Negro at Texarkana, Ed Coy, several months ago pales to insignificance compared with the awful torture to which Smith was subjected. When the news of his capture flashed over the wires last evening, those who felt that no fate was too cruel for the Negro set about preparing for his execution in a manner calculated to strike terror to the Negro element of Texas by making a horrible example of Smith. To such an extreme was the desire to wreak vengeance on the doomed Negro, gratified that the entire civilized world may stand aghast at the manner of his execution. It was no spontaneous affair, but had been carefully planned and was executed in its most appalling details, in a manner calculated to recall scenes of the Dark Ages. When the train bearing the condemned Negro arrived, not only every member of the community was in waiting at the depot to receive him and attend his execution, but there were thousands gathered from all towns within a radius of 100 miles of Paris. Smith's appearance was greeted with wild cheers. There were no efforts to summarily dispose of him. A slow, lingering death awaited him, which for downright torture finds few parallels in the history of the martyrs. After being placed in a wagon, Smith, trembling and livid with fear, was driven to the place where death in awful form awaited him. Out on the bare prairie where stood scattering boisterous shrubs, the scaffold had been built, 4 uprights supported, 10 feet above ground, a platform 10 feet square, railed in except on the south side where a stair ascended. In its center a strong post was set and braced on either side. As the wagon approached, Henry Vance, the father of Smith's victim, appeared on the platform and asked the crowd, now densely packed for hundreds of yards away and numbering 10,000 people, to be quiet. that he wanted for a while to get his revenge, and then he would turn the prisoner over to anyone that wanted him. Here came the wagon, and Smith was carried onto the platform, stripped to the waist and placed against the stake. His legs, arms, and body were corded to it, and he was delivered over to Vance's vengeance to expiate his crime. A tinner's furnace was brought on, filled with irons heated white. Taking one, Vance thrust it under one and then the other side of his victim's feet, who, helpless, writhed as the flesh scarred and peeled from the bones. Slowly, inch by inch, up his legs the irons were drawn and redrawn, only the nervous, jerky twist of the muscles showing the agony being endured. When his body was reached and the iron was pressed to its most tender part, he broke silence for the first time, and a prolonged scream of agony rent the air. Slowly across and around the body, slowly upward traced the irons, the withered, seared flesh marking the progress of the awful punishment. By turns, Smith screamed, prayed, begged, and cursed his torturer. When his face was reached, his tongue was silenced by fire, and thenceforth he only moaned or gave a cry that echoed over the prairie like the wail of a wild animal. Then his eyes were put out, and not a finger's breadth of his body being unscathed, his executioners gave way. They were Vance, his brother-in-law, and Vance's son, a boy 15 years of age. When they gave over punishing Smith, they left the platform. Smith and the clothing about his lower limbs were then saturated with oil, as was the platform. The space beneath was filled with combustibles, and the whole was covered with oil, and fire simultaneously set to his feet and the stack below. A cold, sleeting rain had been falling since noon, silhouetted against the dark, leaden sky. The platform loomed tall and gaunt, and above it, with his head dropped on his breast, blackened and scorched, was the body, and so still was it that all thought him dead. Slowly the flames wrapped him in their bluish veil. A moment they burned so, and then a shudder shook the throne. The head slowly raised, and a broken, quivering cry broke the breathless silence, and was echoed back by shouts and cries from the more thoughtless below. Then the cords binding the arms burned, and he raised the crisp and blackened stumps to wipe the sightless sockets of his eyes. Then the cords about his waist burned, and he toppled forward upon the platform and laid there writhing and quivering in the greedy flames. One foot was still fast and held him on a bed of flame. With one supreme effort, the body, still animated by the supreme desire of escape, rolled over on its face, rose up on its arms, reached up and caught the railing, and with convulsive efforts tore the bound leg loose, and stood reeling on the stumps of its feet. It dragged itself nearly upright against the railing and then dropped, sitting up on the burning platform, its head and arms lying up on the railing and the legs dangling over the edge, and there hung a moment as though this had nearly exhausted its little strength. Then, as the flames roared around him, by another effort he slipped over the edge and fell to the ground. The body lay there still, but was thrust into the mass of fire from beneath the scaffold from which it came, in a few minutes crawling out only to be thrust back again, and the debris of the fire was piled on top, and so did death come to Henry Smith. Every scrap of his clothing was eagerly sought by relic hunters, and when the flames had at length died away, the charred fragments of his bones were raked out and carried away. All lynch mob scenes shown during the course of the entirety of this video are real scenes of lynchings taken by photographers and onlookers. According to the Memphis Commercial Sunday newspaper, the account of the lynching of Lee Walker. In Memphis, Tennessee, not less than 30,000 colored people make their home, and, to the best of their ability, help in the ordinary manner of citizens to make the town prosperous. Of these 30,000, quite a number are poor, and not a few are often short of food, which is a condition that is the portion of many white people in any similar number of population. In July 1892, a colored man named Lee Walker was compelled by want to beg, and did unfortunately commit a small offense for which ordinary law would have punished him with a short imprisonment. He asked alms of two white women who were driving to Memphis, and was refused. Then he pulled one of the women from the buggy and immediately ran away. He cannot be excused for doing even so small a violence on an unprotected woman. His offense deserved and ought to have received legal punishment, but it was given out that a colored man had attempted outrage upon a white woman, and forthwith a manhunt was started by companies of passionate citizens. In the course of 10 days, Walker was caught and taken to Memphis jail, where he ought to have remained for decent trial and just sentence. But the mob took the law into its own hands, dragged him from prison, and lynched him. The writer feels like offering an apology to the reader for inserting the following newspaper article on Walker's case because of its utter fiendishness. But in view of the fact that the woman did not charge him with attempted, he believes that nothing could better reveal the deplorable condition of life in the South than this same article. Here it is. The Memphis Commercial of Sunday, July 23rd, contains a full account of the tragedy from which the following extracts are made. At 12 o'clock last night, Lee Walker, who attempted to outrage Miss Molly McCadden last Tuesday morning, was taken from the county jail and hanged to a telegraph pole just north of the prison. All-day rumors were afloat that with nightfall an attack would be made upon the jail, and as everyone anticipated that a vigorous resistance would be made, a conflict between the mob and the authorities was feared. At 10 o'clock, Captain O'Haver, Sergeant Horan, and several patrolmen were on hand, but they could do nothing with the crowd. An attack by the mob was made on the door in the south wall, and it yielded. At 12 o'clock, the door of the prison was broken in with a rail. As soon as the was brought out of the door, calls were heard for a rope. Then someone shouted, "Burn him!" But there was no time to make a fire. When Walker got into the lobby, a dozen of the men began beating and stabbing him. He was half dragged, half carried to the corner of Front Street and the alley between Sycamore and Mill, and hung to a telegraph pole. The mob proceeded north on Front Street with the victim, stopping at Sycamore Street to get a rope from a grocery. "Take him to the iron bridge on the main street," yelled several men. The men who had hold of the Negro were in a hurry to finish the job. However, and when they reached the telephone pole at the corner of Front Street and the first alley north of Sycamore, they stopped. A hastily improvised noose was slipped over the Negro's head, and several young men mounted a pile of lumber near the pole and drew the rope over one of the iron stepping pins. The Negro was lifted up until his feet were 3 feet above the ground. The rope was made taut, and a corpse dangled in mid-air. A big fellow who helped lead the mob pulled the Negro's legs until his neck cracked. The wretch's clothes had been torn off, and as he swung, the man who pulled his legs mutilated the corpse. 1 or 2 knife cuts, more or less, made little difference in the appearance of the dead. However, for before the rope was around his neck, his skin was cut almost to ribbons. 1 pistol shot was fired while the corpse was hanging. A dozen voices protested against the use of firearms, and there was no more shooting. The body was permitted to hang for half an hour. Then it was cut down and the rope divided amongst those who lingered around the scene of the tragedy. Then it was suggested that the corpse be burned, and it was done. The entire performance, from the assault on the jail to the burning of the dead Negro, was witnessed by a score or so of policemen and as many deputy sheriffs. But not a hand was lifted to stop the proceedings after the jail door yielded. Detective Richardson, who was also a deputy coroner, then proceeded to impanel the following jury of inquest: J.S. Moody, A.C. Waldron, B.J. Childs, J.N. House, Nelson Bills, T.L. Smith, and A. Newhouse. After viewing the body, the inquest was adjourned without any testimony being taken until 9 o'clock this morning. The jury will meet at the coroner's office, 51 Bill Street, upstairs, and decide on a verdict. If no witnesses are forthcoming, the jury will be able to arrive at a verdict just the same, as all members of it saw the lynching. Then someone raised the cry of, "Burn him!" It was quickly taken up and soon resounded from 100 throats. Detective Richardson, for a long time, single-handed, stood the crowd off. He talked and begged the men not to bring disgrace on the city by burning the body, arguing that all the vengeance possible had been wrought. While this was going on, a small crowd was busy starting a fire in the middle of the street. The material was handy. Some bundles of staves were taken from the adjoining lumber yard for kindling. Heavier wood was obtained from the same source, and coal oil from a neighboring grocery. Then the cries of, "Burn him! Burn him!" were redoubled. Half a dozen men seized the naked body. The crowd cheered. They marched to the fire, and giving the body a swing, it was landed in the middle of the fire. There was a cry for more wood, as the fire had begun to die owing to the long delay. Willing hands procured the wood, and it was piled up on the Negro, almost for a time obscuring him from view. The head was in plain view, as also were the limbs, and one arm which stood out high above the body, the elbow crooked, held in that position by a stick of wood. In a few moments the hands began to swell. Then came great blisters over all the exposed parts of the body. Then in places the flesh was burned away and the bones began to show through. It was a horrible sight, one which perhaps none there had ever witnessed before. It proved too much for a large part of the crowd, and the majority of the mob left very shortly after the burning began. The rope that was used to hang the Negro, and also that which was used to lead him from the jail, were eagerly sought by relic hunters. They almost fought for a chance to cut off a piece of rope, and in an incredibly short time both ropes had disappeared and were scattered in the pockets of the crowd in sections of from an inch to 6 inches long. Others of the relic hunters remained until the ashes cooled to obtain such ghastly relics as the teeth, nails, and bits of charred skin of the immolated victim of his own lust. After burning the body, the mob tied a rope around the charred trunk and dragged it down Main Street to the courthouse, where it was hanged to a center pole. The rope broke and the corpse dropped with a thud, but it was again hoisted, the charred legs barely touching the ground. The teeth were knocked out and the fingernails cut off as souvenirs. The crowd made so much noise that the police interfered. Undertaker Walsh was telephoned for, who took charge of the body and carried it to his establishment, where it will be prepared for burial in the Potter's Field today. It is impossible to describe the loathsomeness of this revolting murder. It is enough to say it was done in the open, in the presence of representatives of the law, and without so much as identification of the man by the woman. Mr. R.C.O. Benjamin, attorney at law, in his pamphlet, Southern Outrages, affords much information. The following quotations will tell their own story. When the white men of the South left their homes to join the army and fight the North, the colored slave was left in charge, and not a single case of outrage has been reported against him. None during the whole war period, none to this day. Wives, children, and property were left behind, and he, in thousands of cases, was the only man about to sow and gather harvest and protect the home. He labored and obeyed and suffered the indignity of a slave's condition as in former years, yet never attempted outrage. But now he is free. This charge is made against him indiscriminately. In the town of Jackson, Tennessee in 1886, a black woman was lynched because a white woman who engaged her as cook had by someone been poisoned. It appears that a box of rat poison was found in the cook's room, which was evidence enough of her guilt in the eyes of the mob, and she was soon lodged in jail. Thence she was dragged, stripped of every garment, and hanged perfectly naked in the public courthouse square, without protest of any kind being made. No trial was held, neither was anyone arrested for the murder. The inhabitants, officials of the law included, looked upon the matter quite complacently. But what followed? The husband of the poisoned woman became insane, gave every indication in his ravings of his own guilt, and died a maniac, leaving behind him at least a suspicion that he was the poisoner of his wife. In the vicinity of Columbia, Matagorda, Texas, in September 1887, a colored constable named Messina was serving writs, which was his duty. A white man named Sanborn was among the number upon whom he had to serve a writ, and he called in the ordinary manner at Sanborn's house to discharge his legal task. The white man, using profane language, declared that should arrest him. And before Messina had time to do more than say he was only doing his duty, Sanborn shot him and fled. What followed? His white friends gave out the report that Sanborn had been killed by the Negroes. Then an armed mob and the sheriff visited the colored settlements on Sunday, arrested without warrant many Negroes, killed 5 and wounded 7 of them for refusing to be arrested, and then gave an alarm of a Negro rising against the whites. For some days it was the ordinary affair of daily life to be forced to flee from the neighborhood to save themselves, and numbers of them were shot without compunction. Of course, nobody was punished, but Sanborn was brought from his hiding place. Regiments were marched through Matagorda, and a ball was held to wind up the affair. The Turks in Armenia have not done worse than this. In the month of August 1888, at New Iberia, Louisiana, 10 Negroes were done to death for being too prosperous and not behaving correctly toward white people. Antonio Smith, Ransom Livingstone, Peter Simon, John Simon, Thomas Simon, and Sam Cokie, all of them most respectable men and property owners, and 4 others whose names are not given, were butchered by a mob for no crime whatever. The authorities took no notice of the matter, and the murderers were thought nothing the worse for their sport. It is a sport which will yet cost the states more than she imagines. In the year 1889, and during all his life, a colored doctor named Rosamore Cormier lived in Lafayette Parish, Louisiana, with his wife and daughter, and owned his home. The whites did not like to live among them, and told Cormier so, and ordered him to get out several times. Seeing he had no intention of getting out, they whipped him most severely, and told him they would make him go. He stayed where he was. One night, the usual mob surrounded his house and demanded that the door be opened, which Cormier knew meant that he was to be lynched. He fired on the mob and fled. Then the mob broke in, destroyed his goods, dragged out his 16-year-old daughter, and cut her throat. And, one report says, washed their hands in her blood. His wife quite unintentionally told them the way her husband had gone, whom they pursued and overtook and shot him for being a doctor and living in a respectable manner with his wife and daughter. Poor Cormier was ordered to go away, and because he refused, he and his child were murdered. In June 1890, a Negro named George Swayze, who lived in East Feliciana, was butchered by a large company of white men. The police did not want him because he had done no crime, but the mob thought it time for to be lynched, and therefore lynched him. The poor man was in bed when the white men arrived at his house, but they dragged him out into the rain and dark night and dispatched him. What for? Until now, nobody has been able to find out. It is enough for a company of white men to agree that a certain has lived long enough, or to imagine he is a nuisance to them, or to have a petty quarrel with him, and, decision being made, he is lynched, and all legal authorities look on in pitiable helplessness. At Tullahoma, Tennessee, Will Lewis, a Negro boy of 18 years, was lynched in the month of August, 1891. It is no part of the writer's duty to defend drunkenness, but every man must in justice demand that even drunkards receive fair trial and judgment. But when a boy of 18 years, only 18, is taken and murdered in cold blood for being drunk and impertinent to white people, what can anyone say? Thought is paralyzed and speech is impossible. One can only look on the crime and wonder at the condition of the morals of the country in which it is done. Will Lewis may have been impertinent to white people. He may have been drunk, which charges were never proved. But compared with his white murderers, he was an angel. At Hollandale, Mississippi, Lou Stevens was hanged from a railway bridge because she was suspected of being accessory to the murder of a white man who regularly committed adultery with her. This happened in 1892, and in the same year, a girl of 15 years of age was in a smaller manner hanged at Rayville, Louisiana, because the mob believed she had poisoned white persons. At Texarkana, Texas, on the 20th day of February, 1892, Edward Coy was burned to death. He was taken alive and tied to a stake, and in the presence of thousands of persons, the white woman who charged him with assault applied the match. In the year 1892, at Jonesville, Louisiana, a triple murder was committed by the mob on a father, son, and daughter. This Negro was suspected of murdering a white man. First, the inhuman inhabitants took his son, aged 16, and his daughter, aged 14, and hanged them, subsequently filling their bodies with bullets, and then lynched the poor father himself, who perhaps was not sorry to follow his children. At Bardwell, Kentucky, C.J. Miller was lynched July 7, 1893. On July 5th, two white girls were found murdered and their bodies mutilated, but no satisfactory clue to the author of the tragedy could be found. In any society governed by laws of civilization, detectives would have been set to work and every effort made to find the murderer. But the people of Bardwell jumped to the conclusion that a Negro had done the foul deed, and at once began to look for one. Miller was arrested in Sikeston, Missouri, and was handed over to the authorities of Kentucky. He gave his right name without hesitation, and an account of his movements from the 1st to the 5th of July, the latter date being that of the murder. He said, "My name is C.J. Miller. I am of Springfield, Illinois. My wife lives at 716 North 2nd Street. I am here among you today looked upon as one of the most brutal men before the people. I stand here surrounded by men who are excited, men who are not willing to let the law take its course. And as far as the law is concerned, I have committed no crime, and certainly no crime gross enough to deprive me of my life or liberty to walk upon the green earth. I had some rings which I bought in Bismarck of a Jew peddler. I paid him $4.50 for them. I left Springfield on the 1st day of July and came to Alton. From Alton I went to East St. Louis. From there to Jefferson Barracks, thence to DeSoto, thence to Bismarck, and to Piedmont, thence to Poplar Bluff, thence to Hoxie, to Jonesboro, and then on a local freight to Malden, from there to Sykeston. On the 5th day of July, the day I was supposed to have committed the offense, I was at Bismarck. No statement of a man's movements could be clearer, and nothing might have been easier for the police to investigate. One visit to Bismarck would have been sufficient to clear the Negro of the charge, or to have cast suspicion on his story. No investigation was made. The mob took him by force from the jail, tore off his clothing, and hanged him to a telegraph pole. Within 12 hours of his arrest, he was a dead man with toes and fingers cut off. After his murder, his statement was proven true. On the 16th of November, 1895, a young lady named Miss Jones was found in an unconscious condition in the garden of her home at 6 o'clock in the evening. At 8 o'clock, the city policeman arrested a man named James Goings and placed him in the jail. At once a rumor of Negro outrage was spread through the town, which was Frederick, North Dakota. And as the night wore on, a crowd gathered and became too large for the authorities to handle. And at midnight, they attacked the jail and took Goings out in his underclothing. A lawyer, a newspaper man, and other prominent citizens being the leaders. Half an hour later, Goings was hanging from a chestnut tree near the town, on which a Negro was hanged in November 1887. When the untried and unrecognized man had been safely swung up, the lynchers amused themselves by shooting at him. Such brutality causes despair of heart, also amazement that a civilized country can permit it to be done. At Gilson, Glasscock County, on November 21st, 1895, Balaam Hancock, a Negro, was lynched before daylight. For what? Miss Desi Shelton, a girl 17 years old, said he had tried to assault her. Rightly enough, the police, on receipt of the report, set out to find him, and eventually he was caught in Jefferson County and lodged in jail. Not one word will be found in this book in the way of apology for wrongdoing. Indeed, we say with all earnestness, arrest and punish severely every man who attempts to violate the honor of our wives and daughters. But let justice be done. It is one of the best-known facts of life in the southern states that white men constantly outrage black women, and that never a word is spoken about the matter. Balaam Hancock attempted outrage, it was said, but not proven, and was arrested and placed in jail, and then by force taken therefrom and hanged to a tree. We would ask this question: if a black man is a brute when he attempts outrage and merits death, what are the white men who hang him without trial? And what do they deserve? After the next lynching coming up, Reverend P. Thomas Stanford has concluding remarks. Walaikum salam. On the 18th of February, 1897, about 8 miles from Roxie, Mississippi, a murder was committed of the most dastardly nature. Ben Land, a colored man, and his wife lived on a piece of United States land, which by hard, continuous labor they had improved. Late at night, when he and his wife were asleep, armed men surrounded his little home, sprinkled it with coal oil, set it on fire, and waited. Soon the place was enveloped in flames, and poor Land and his wife rushed out into the darkness to save their lives. She did escape, but he was shot down the moment he emerged from his burning home, and was found next morning with all the top and back of his head shot off. His only offense was living on that particular piece of land, which was proven in the state's court. He was known as a quiet, industrious man, and lived on terms of peace and goodwill with everybody. The fact is, A white family wanted the property and had approached land in respect of it, who, having consulted Honorable S.A. Beadle, an attorney at law, intended compromising with them, because he knew that henceforth his life would not be safe. He was not allowed to live long enough to carry out his purpose. He was murdered, and his wife was turned out to do as best she could. And white men saw the deed done, did it, and went on their way in a Christian country. We have given this account of these lynchings in the briefest manner, and have striven to avoid the use of inflammatory language. They tell their own story, and are a fearful reflection on the social condition of life in the South of the United States. 1,697 colored men, women, and children have been lynched to death in the last 15 years, and other outrages on the race have been perpetuated, more than can be counted. It has been enough for a white man to make a charge against a black man to cause the mob to arrange punishment or a lynching, and legal officials have been powerless to prevent them. For attempted, for suspected murder, for marrying a white person, and for no reason given, these lynchings have been done in defiance of law, and the spirit which did them obtains at this hour in the South. If a white man commits on a black woman, no notice is taken of it, not even by the police, and these murders in the light of day are done without any attempt being made to punish the murderers. Lynch law might as well be written in the Constitution of many states. It is in full force and flourishes in not a few of them. Public opinion, if there be such a thing on this question, is impotent and can avail nothing. Which terrible fact ought to stir the churches of both North and South to begin a campaign of education and of denunciation. How long, O Lord, how long shall this horror continue?